June 6, 1944, Normandy, France. Dawn breaks unevenly through low cloud and drifting smoke. The air smells of damp earth, cordite and crushed grass. Somewhere inland from Utah Beach, artillery shells continue to fall with mechanical regularity, their concussions rolling across the hedgerows like distant thunder. Each blast lands with purpose, walking steadily toward the shoreline where Allied troops are struggling ashore. In a field bordered by trees and broken stone walls, a small group of American paratroopers gathers itself after a chaotic night drop. They are scattered, under strength, and cut off from most of their unit. Their radios are unreliable, maps are soaked. The plan they trained for no longer exists. Standing among them is a young lieutenant, calm to the point of stillness. His name is Richard Winters. Within the next hour, Winters will lead fewer than a dozen men in an assault that military historians would later study as a textbook example of small unit leadership. 4 German artillery guns firing on Utah Beach will be silenced. The landing below will become survivable, and one of the defining moments of airborne warfare will unfold not through overwhelming force, but through clarity, discipline, and initiative. At that moment, however, nothing feels legendary. The invasion of Normandy had been planned for years. It depended on synchronization at a scale never attempted before: naval bombardment, airborne drops, amphibious landings, and armored advances all timed to the minute. The airborne mission assigned to the Easy Company was brutally clear: land behind enemy lines, disrupt German defenses, and prevent reinforcements from reaching the beaches. What the men expected was confusion, danger, and heavy resistance, but also cohesion. They expected to fight alongside their platoons and companies, supported by familiar faces and clear chains of command. What they experienced was fragmentation. Scattered across miles of countryside by flak, wind, and darkness, paratroopers landed alone or in small groups. Some were injured on landing, others drowned in flooded fields. Units that had trained together for years struggled simply to find one another. The German defenses, though surprised, were intact in key areas. One of those areas was Brecourt Manor. From this position, 4 105mm guns were firing directly onto the causeways leading from Utah Beach. Each shell that landed threatened to turn the beachhead into a killing zone. If the guns were not silenced quickly, the entire landing could stall or collapse. Winters did not arrive at Brecourt with orders to attack it. He arrived with information and a decision. Reconnaissance revealed the layout. The guns were dug in along a hedgerow, connected by trenches, protected by machine guns and infantry. In theory, this position required a coordinated assault by a reinforced platoon or more. Winters had 12 men. What followed was not improvisation born of recklessness, but disciplined action rooted in training. Winters had absorbed doctrine thoroughly. He understood fire and movement, suppression, and the value of initiative when higher command was absent. The battlefield had stripped away hierarchy. What remained was responsibility. The recurring sound that defined the moment was the German artillery firing toward the beach. Steady, impersonal, relentless. Each blast reinforced the urgency. Each delay meant more men dying below. Winters divided his force into assault and support elements. One team provided suppressive fire. Another moved along the hedgerow, attacking each gun position sequentially rather than simultaneously. It was a methodical approach designed to reduce risk and conserve strength. German defenders expected a frontal assault, if any came at all. What they encountered instead was movement they could not track, fire they could not localize, and an enemy that adapted faster than they could respond. One by one, the guns were neutralized. Explosives were placed. Crews were killed, wounded, or captured. German counterattacks failed to regain control. Despite casualties, the small American force maintained momentum. By the time reinforcements arrived, the position was already broken. The immediate result was tactical. Fire onto Utah Beach ceased. The landing stabilized. The invasion gained breathing room. But the deeper significance lay elsewhere. The action at Brecourt Manor demonstrated how modern warfare, despite its scale, still depended on small groups led by individuals capable of thinking clearly under pressure. Winters did not rely on heroics. He relied on principles, simplicity, discipline and responsibility for the men around him. The symbolic object of this moment was the hedgerow itself, dense, confining, obscuring vision. For the Germans it was protection. For Winters it was terrain to be used, not feared. American doctrine emphasized adaptability, initiative, and decentralized leadership. At Brecourt, those ideas became reality. Winters would later downplay the event, insisting he merely did his duty. Yet the army would study the assault for decades, not because it was dramatic, but because it worked. In the larger context of the war, Brecourt Manor was a small fight on a massive day, but it captured a defining truth of the Allied approach, that leadership did not wait for perfect conditions or complete orders. It acted when necessity demanded it. What Easy Company expected on D-Day was confusion and danger. What they experienced was responsibility stripped to its core. And what emerged from that hedgerow was not just a silenced battery, but a model of how disciplined initiative could change the course of events far beyond a single field in Normandy. The aftermath of the assault at Brecourt Manor unfolded almost as quietly as it had begun. The guns lay silent, their barrels twisted and blackened. Smoke drifted low along the hedgerows, mixing with the smell of earth and explosives. For the men of Easy Company who had taken part, there was little time to reflect. Ammunition was low. Casualties needed attention. The wider battle was only beginning. Yet even in those first hours, the significance of what had happened was already taking shape. German artillery doctrine relied on fixed positions, overlapping fields of fire, and the assumption that any serious assault would require time to organize and mass. What the defenders at Brecourt encountered violated those assumptions completely. A small, understrength American force had attacked immediately, without waiting for orders, using speed and method rather than numbers. The guns had been defeated not by overwhelming force, but by tempo. For the German soldiers who survived, the experience was disorienting. They had expected to repel airborne troops until reinforcements arrived. Instead, they faced an enemy that refused to pause, that exploited every fold in the terrain, and that seemed to understand the position almost as well as they did. The hedgerows that were meant to protect them became channels of attack. This contrast between expectation and reality echoed across Normandy in the days that followed. German units anticipated a conventional landing followed by cautious consolidation. What they encountered instead was relentless pressure from dispersed American forces that acted independently, aggressively, and often without direct supervision. At Brecourt, this approach had been embodied by Winters' leadership style. He did not issue elaborate speeches or rigid commands. He assigned clear tasks, trusted his men, and adjusted continuously as the situation evolved. When casualties occurred, others stepped forward. When a plan needed modification, it was modified immediately. The action illustrated a broader shift in military culture. The American airborne forces had been trained to operate in isolation, to assume that confusion was normal, and that initiative was not a luxury, but a requirement. This philosophy stood in contrast to more centralized command structures that struggled when communication broke down. The recurring sound of artillery, now absent from the manor, became its own measure of success. The silence was not dramatic, it was functional. Each minute without shellfire meant fewer casualties on the beach, more supplies moving inland, more momentum preserved. Victory in this context was measured in absence rather than spectacle. As reports filtered upward through the chain of command, the assault at Brecourt began to take on instructional value. Officers noted how Winters had applied basic infantry principles under extreme conditions: suppressive fire, maneuver, use of cover, and sequential objectives. None of this was revolutionary. What was remarkable was the discipline with which it was executed by exhausted men in an unfamiliar environment. Winters himself resisted any notion of heroism. In later reflections, he emphasized preparation over bravery. Training had provided a framework. Responsibility had provided motivation. The outcome, he believed, was the natural result of both. This attitude mattered. It reinforced a view of leadership that prized competence over charisma. Winters did not lead by inspiring awe. He led by being reliable. In the uncertainty of D-Day, that reliability became a form of strength. The symbolic weight of Brecourt Manor grew in the years after the war, particularly as veterans' accounts and historical studies revisited the invasion. The assault came to represent more than a tactical success. It became an example of how decentralized decision-making could function effectively within a larger strategic plan. American abundance played a subtle but decisive role here as well. The airborne doctrine that empowered officers like Winters was supported by extensive training, logistical depth, and institutional trust. Men were trained thoroughly, equipped adequately, and expected to think independently. This confidence in individuals was itself a product of a system that could afford mistakes, learn from them, and adapt. In contrast, German defenses at Normandy were constrained by shortages, rigid command structures, and an inability to respond quickly to unexpected developments. The guns at Brecourt were formidable, but they were static. Once their assumptions were broken, they could not recover. The transformation that occurred that morning was not only tactical, it was psychological. For the men of Easy Company, Brecourt confirmed that initiative worked, that decisive action, even when outnumbered, could succeed. For the German defenders, it was a warning that the invasion would not be contained by doctrine alone. The broader invasion of Normandy would grind on for weeks, through hedgerows and villages, at enormous cost. Brecourt Manor did not decide the campaign, but it revealed how the campaign could be won, through countless small actions led by individuals who understood their responsibility and acted without waiting for perfect conditions. In the end, the guns at Brecourt mattered because of what they represented. They were obstacles designed to delay, to punish, to enforce a defensive vision of war. Their destruction signaled the arrival of a different approach, one built on flexibility, trust, and sustained effort. That approach would carry the Allies from the beaches through France and ultimately into Germany itself. And at the center of it, on that quiet Norman morning, stood a lieutenant who understood that leadership at its core was not about rank or recognition, but about making the right decision when no one else could make it for you. The final meaning of Brecourt Manor only fully emerges when it is placed within the larger arc of the Normandy invasion and the war that followed. What happened along that hedgerow was not an anomaly, it was a preview. As Allied forces pushed inland from Utah and Omaha beaches, they encountered the same pattern again and again. Strong German positions built on sound defensive logic, yet increasingly vulnerable to an enemy that refused to fight predictably. The airborne landings had shattered cohesion, but they had also unleashed initiative. Small units moved, acted, and adapted faster than centralized command could respond. The assault led by Richard Winters became a distilled example of this reality. The German guns at Brecourt had been designed to dominate terrain through firepower. They assumed time to observe, to react, to coordinate. Winters denied them that time. By attacking immediately, by moving decisively, and by breaking the position piece by piece, he turned a powerful defense into a series of isolated problems. This approach would define much of the Allied advance after D-Day. The war in Normandy was not won by grand maneuvers alone, but by thousands of similar actions, squads and platoons pushing forward through confusion, hedgerows, villages and crossroads, often without guidance from higher headquarters. The strength of the Allied system was that it expected this and prepared for it. American abundance underpinned this philosophy. Training was extensive. Ammunition and equipment were available. Replacement leaders existed at every level. A lieutenant could act independently because the system trusted him to do so, and could absorb the consequences if he failed. This trust was not abstract, it was institutional. For German forces, the contrast was stark. Defensive doctrine emphasized holding ground and waiting for orders. Communications disruptions crippled response. Reserves could not move freely under Allied air power. Once positions like Brécourt were penetrated, recovery was difficult or impossible. The recurring sound that frames this story, the thunder of artillery falling silent, serves as its clearest symbol. Silence meant success. Silence meant lives spared on the beach. Silence meant momentum preserved. In modern war, victory often announces itself not with cheers, but with the absence of destruction. Richard Winters never claimed Brécourt as a personal triumph. In later years, he consistently redirected attention to the men who followed him, to the training they shared, and to the responsibility they carried for one another. He rejected the idea that heroism was an individual quality. To him, it was a function of leadership exercised in service of others. That perspective is what gives the episode its enduring power. The guns at Brécourt Manor were not the most heavily fortified in Normandy. The force that attacked them was not the strongest. The terrain was not favorable, and yet the outcome shaped the opening hours of the invasion. It demonstrated that disciplined initiative could overcome strength, and that leadership under pressure could ripple outward far beyond a single engagement. In the years after the war, military academies would study Brécourt Manor not as a legend, but as a lesson. Strip away the mythology, and what remains is clarity. Understand the mission, act decisively, use what you have, and accept responsibility for the outcome. That clarity defined Richard Winters' leadership, not only at Brécourt, but throughout the campaign in Europe. It was leadership grounded in restraint, competence, and moral seriousness. A kind of leadership shaped by democratic systems that valued initiative over obedience and preparation over spectacle. The invasion of Normandy would succeed at tremendous cost. The war would continue for nearly another year. But on that morning, in a field bordered by hedgerows, a small group of men proved that even amid chaos, order could be imposed, not by command alone, but by judgment. That is why Brécourt Manor endures. Not because it was dramatic, not because it was famous, but because it worked.